The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our weekly webinars on IFC collaboration. Today, we'll be touching base on the exchange of files, but this time we'll be focusing on group systems and types. For those of you who are new to this series of webinars, what we're doing is going through the process of exchanging IFC files in some sort of an imaginary project that we're building up. And we already went through the part where we were setting up a file from the point of view of Archicad. Then we started creating the initial translators to exchange the initial sets of files that will be from Archicad to IFC, sharing those across. We explained the different ways of creating those different translators in the beginning. And then we are at a stage where we imagine that we have received a first set of files, which we did in the last couple of webinars. So in those, we were mimicking the process of receiving those new files, linking in those new files, showing how much control do we have over the geometry and to some extent over the data that is included in those IFC files. And this time, we're going to cover some of the details of the data that is included in those files, group systems and types. So welcome to the webinar. And for the next 30 minutes, I, Nando Mogollon, will take you through the process of showing you how to do that. In case you need to subscribe, you want to subscribe from the screen there, you can either type in that particular web address there on the screen, or simply scan with your phones that QR code on the screen that should take you straight to that website so that you can subscribe to any following webinars on the series. So as we said, today we'll be focusing only for 30 minutes, so we don't have a lot of time, but that's the whole idea of having these on a weekly basis. Making sense of that IFC linked file that we brought in the last time. And some of the bits and pieces can also be applied to the file that we'll be producing. But this time we'll be focusing on the classes and types, since I've got a few questions last time regarding the types. And I know that can be confusing because the word types is used in IFC terms in several different places for different purposes. So we want to clarify that. Then we want to touch base on groups and systems, because IFC has the capacity to create multi-level type of groups and systems, and they're used for different purposes. I think I'm missing zones there, but we'll talk about that. And of course, we'll show you a practical example of that, because in theory, it can be very, very synthetic, very artificial. So we need to see a good example on that. So hope I can give you one. As always, on GoToWebinar, you'll have a panel with questions. Feel free to ask questions at any point in time. I'm actually going to open that now so that I can keep an eye on that on the side. If I don't manage to get to your questions today, if there are too many of them, then we can address that on our next webinar next Tuesday. All right, so let's start jumping right ahead. So let's talk about classes and types. First thing that you probably have seen is that in Archicad, you have this thing called a classification system. In the latest iteration for both 24 and 23, the Archicad classes have also a breakdown structure, sort of kind of this example here, using a beam to exemplify what I'm trying to explain here. The beam is the actual element class inside the Archicad class, but then inside there you have like individual specific classes. Now they don't seem to be super comprehensive. They seem to be like a very specific set of types or classes of specific classes of beams. And the reason for that to exist is because they actually are mapping into the standard IFC types of objects. So that's one way of using the word types inside the IFC context. And what that is that IFC entities, which they're referred as entities, things like beams and walls and columns and so on, the beams can have what they call object types. And the object types in the current version of IFC, for IFC 4, it's divided into these short list in here as default. And then it also gives you the opportunity or gives you the chance to define your own if you think that you want to deviate from that whole list. So see that beam, it's actually a type. So that's when you don't want to classify it as anything in specific. But if you want to classify a particular beam as a joist, as a hollow core, lintel, spandrel, a T-beam, and so on, you can do so. And that is a direct map to the Archicad classes. So the Archicad classes right now, as per Archicad 23 and 24, actually map directly to that type definition inside IFC. So that's for the predefined types, if you like. Now, in the construction world, we actually call types also the specific type of or classification or subclassification of a construction element. For instance, what type of partition wall that is, and then we'll say, well, that's a 90 millimeter stud partition wall, and then that's what we may refer as to be the type. So if you look at IFC walls, for instance, instead of beams, you'll see that partitions are a predefined type, but not the 90 millimeter one, or 90 millimeter with a insulation on top, or with a safe security grill or mesh on one side. None of that is included, since that tends to be fairly either project or country or region specific. So for that super specification of those types, that's when we have in Archicad, in IFC, the so-called element type or its type name. They're both included. And one example of that will be an IPE type of beam or a specific size, right? Or a universal beam or universal column, or whatever other industrialized type of product that defines a particular beam. And that can all be part of a predefined joist, predefined lintel, and so on. So what you'll see here is that there's a direct relationship in between the Archicad classes and the IFC predefined types. But in between the predefined types and the element type name or type, simply type, there is a parent to child relationship where what you will be expecting is that you classify that as one of the predefined types or simply not define it, but you still have the option to give it a type or a type name. So we want to take a look at where that happens, since that might be relevant information for you to include inside your IFC files, and definitely important information for those of you who are producing IFC files that you'll be used for quantity surveying, since the different types may have already different costing and order in the production line of the supply chain. So that's one thing that we need to take a look at that inside Archicad. Let's go right ahead and I'll show you that in the file. So I've got, as you know, I have our building here. For those of you who have been following this, that's where that's the building we're using for the exercise. And what happens is that inside the file, you may use, for internal purposes, you may use things like the ID to give the elements its type. You may use, it's very typical, for instance, for walls, you may use a wall composition. Let's say that's a wall with a particular composition, that will be its type. Now, all of that can be used for the purpose of translating that into IFC, but you have to tell the file to do so. So let's first bring in the IFC project manager, which now you know there is a direct representation or translation of the file in IFC terms. And I need to show you the following thing in here. So we've got here our list of stories, and then inside every story you will have all the element types that we've got in this particular file. What I want to show you here is something that we have created new. So let's take a look at this thing because we're going to use the same as an example in a minute. So the only thing that is new in this file is that I've created this entry here. And the entry, I've created it with a couple of extrusions. So those are profile beams as tools, but I have classified that as a cladding. So they'll come through as a little cladding there, a roof piece, and then some hangers that I've made up thinking that might work for holding this canopy at the entrance. Now, this is a good example since these bits and pieces here are made of products. So these are profiles that you just go and buy. Doesn't make sense for you to come up with your own design of that since that's already something that exists. So for those, you will very likely will create types, right? So you can have the types being driven by anything, but since that profile already has a name, I probably would like to use that as the element type and type name. So you do that from the IFC project manager. And then if you go all the way down to this second portion down here, that's always going to give you a list of different things, including system of grouping or assignments, which we're going to talk about that in a minute, and then the type products. And they will be listed depending on the IFC entity types. So in my case, I have those things being columns. So they should be inside this column type. So you expand this thing. I'm probably going to find different lists in there. The one in gray with the italic letters, those are coming from the file that I have linked in. So I won't be able to modify that. That's why that's grayed out. But these ones here have a direct relationship to the file that I've created. So what you'll see here is that those 6 are a direct representation to these 6 down here, right? And you see by their name, it's actually the ID, which is the way I map it. But the element type is created with this particular name in here. And you know that because this entity here called the element type as a name has a predefined type, which is exactly what I explained a minute ago. And that can have different subclasses or subtypes, if you like. We're going to keep that as column, but you can set it as non-defined or simply user-defined, up to you. That's not going to lose its parent classification as column. It's still a column type, as you can see there. We can specify that in more detail if you need. But then the type name, which is an attribute of the type, that's the one they want to give it. Now, as anything else in this file, you see that every time you see this link button, it means that it's being pre-populated with information coming from the file. In this one case, that is actually coming from the translator that I'm using, that one here, under the property the type mapping. Not the type mapping, sorry about that. It's actually the property mapping. There you go. And in the property mapping, you have a full list of elements, but you can also actually filter that from this drop-down list so that you can only see the type objects. So the types and the elements are not the same. The types are actually specifying information about the different types that you are creating for the project. In my case, I have element type and then columns, and then the name in here, I have created a new rule where I've added the building material or the composite or the profile or the fill to be mapping the name type. That should be enough, so I'm going to keep it like so. I could be doing the same thing. I believe the same thing I've done it with walls, which is very common. You may want to add, like in my case, I've added the position to make it either exterior or interior, but let's focus on the columns right now. where the name I've had linked that with the name of the profile. So I can link that to that. I can add that, add more to this, but I'll leave it as so. So that is the type, not the actual elements. Click that on OK, and then update this. That's where this name here is coming. So typical or another example might be doors and windows. It is the same. You probably are going to give them a name coming from somewhere. So if you go check your doors and windows, they may have some names. Mine are coming from the size, but that's just given. There's nothing special on that. And I don't believe I have windows on this. Yeah, no. Wall types and so on. So pretty much all it's coming from the same type of information. But what is important is that you know that the type itself, this so-called type here, which appears has to be the name, it's actually given by or mapped by you. And when you do so and you export the file, which we're going to do in a minute, you'll see that popping up in the types list inside the IFC. So actually, I'm going to close this. Let's go back to our PowerPoint. So though that's related to the type name and they're different to the predefined types. The other thing that we want to touch base will be this whole idea of group systems and zones. So IFC creates assignments, which is basically relationships in between different elements. Now, probably the three bigger groups that you will be able to manipulate within Archicad, and they might serve you some good purpose, will be general groups of elements, IFC systems, specifically for MAP type of elements, or when you want to create a group of elements that you probably want to hand over or coordinate with a mechanical engineer or electrical engineer. Those can be grouped as an IFC system. Then you hand over the system rather than just a simple number of elements. And the same may apply for structural, when you want to classify and organize an entire system for the sake of handing over only elements that are load bearing. That's a group, or you can create that as a group. And the other one, which is very important, particularly in the beginning of a project, and maybe at the end when you're comparing that, anything that is being planned against or is being actually done, is grouping in a hierarchical way the spaces on your project so that different individual rooms make up for a unit, and the different units probably make up for the private areas of a story or a level. And then you do the same for exterior areas, and then you do the same for circulation, and you can group them and make like a breakdown structure of the spatial division of the project. You can do so by using IFC zones and dropping in there all the spaces that you have used in the particular file. So let's go and take a look at that and how you create that and how you probably use that in a practical way. So using the same example we have here, let's say, and you probably have seen, actually, let's go and jump back to my last current file, my coordination file that I have in Solibri. Again, you can use this in either Solibri as a viewer or any other IFC viewer. I'm using Solibri because I'm used to it, and I think they work pretty well. So in my most current file, the one that I have delivered, I don't really have an entrance to the building. It's just that facade there. So I wanted to add that. But because it's something that it came up lately, I probably want to highlight that to the structural engineer so that they can take over that bit and probably give it the right shape. All I have in there is kind of the overall appearance. So I want that to look like that. I have suggested some hangers there, but that might be different, probably not needed to be that strong, or maybe it's a different solution that's required altogether, but that's basically what I want, something like that. Now, rather than just simply sending the structural engineer some screenshots of this, I actually want them to have access to the objects that I have created and edited, and I want them to be super clear for them what is it that I have included that is new. So that might be a good example for me to add inside the IFC Project Manager a group that specifies that that is a single entity in some kind, or that these different elements are related to each other in a particular way. So that you do by using this first option here, the one that with the plus symbol that calls for assignments. And in here, you'll be able to specify, as I explained in the beginning, groups, which is almost any particular type of elements that might be logically be grouped for any particular reason. Zones, again, a hierarchical distribution of spaces belonging to each other or somehow related to each other. And then systems, which can be added to the space containers, building systems that can be associated to assemblies or furnishing elements, particularly useful for things like office spaces and or hospitality, where the individual equipment needs to be related to each other and belong to other bigger groups, and distribution systems, which are typically MAP type of systems. Think of that as cold water or hot water, the different systems of the same mechanical discipline, or ventilation, air supply and returns, all of that. Now, let's focus on the groups, since I'm only handing this canopy over to the structural engineer. So all you have to do is take that, create a new group in here. So I already have a few of them, but let's go ahead and create a new one. So what I'll do here is select that index there, click this new button down here. That's just going to create a group that down there. I'll just going to give it a name. Let's call it canopy. That'll be just enough. And then all we'll need to do will be to get those elements and drop them inside this folder, which is going to create a new relationship in between all of those elements. To do so, I've already pre-selected those using the selection toolbar, the selection palette. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it'll be very useful if you know how to use it. And essentially what I've done is I already pre-saved those elements. So I just need to double click on that. That's going to pre-select that. And I know that by doing so, those bits are already pre-selected in here. So all I need to do is, well, wait for a second until it refreshes. And drag it into that one new folder for that relationship there. And that's going to create a relationship in between all of them, making a canopy out of that. So the only thing that I need to do from here will be, I can move these to the side and then export this IFC again, for which don't need to come to this again. I already have a publisher set for that. And I could just simply go ahead and export this. Now, someone asked the question probably too early, way before we were actually talking about these things, but these might be a good situation to explain this bit. Whenever you have only new things you think you may add to a particular file, Archicad actually gives you the chance to simply add new elements to an existing file. That can be done. You just need to make sure that you filter that out from the screen, which might be the most explicit way for you to do it. So it'll be very certain that you're going to get the right result. And simply update an existing file you have somewhere with additional content. It won't be able to delete anything that is inside. It won't be able to modify the existing elements, but you will be able to add on top of it. So the way you do that will be, I'm not going to do it in here for, because I already have a few other elements, will be filtering them out so you only have the elements that you have. And inside your Open Beam menu, you'll have this option called Merge to IFC Model. And what that will do is exactly that. It will take whatever new elements you have in here and merge it on top of an existing file, right? So that's why it doesn't say update, doesn't say modify, it simply says merge. So you take that and drop it on top of an existing IFC file. So that's still an option. So in this particular case, I'm just going to export that using the translator. But I've already done that just to save time since we already have 4 more minutes. So let's go ahead and move to Solibri. And then in here, I still have the old files. I haven't updated that from here. But let's go ahead and take this and click on update. There you go. So now what you have here is I have an update of the file. You'll see that the file now brings in the canopy as expected. Nothing new there. But what I really wanted to show you here is that now my file, when I open this, you'll see that the breakdown structure actually comes with an additional folder called group, and that will list any groups that I have in this particular file. In my case, that will be the things on the envelope. Oh, actually, I don't think I actually have updated this. So let's do it in the background there. I'm going to show you what I did before there, which is just as good while we wait for that to update. So what I've done here, it's a multi-level, which is also very common. It's a multi-level grouping where I have a bigger group for the envelope, so I can use that to filter this out. So now I have multiple elements that all belong to the envelope group that I have created, but also have individual items inside the envelope. So that is one group, and that group is composed of this cladding that I have in there and several curtain walls, like so. So it allows you to build this hierarchical series of groups on top of each other. Let me see if I've got that updated already. That's still saving. Okay, now it's finished. There you go. Now I have a canopy here. So same thing. If I want to call the attention to the structure engineer, all I need to do is to say, hey, just look at that and look for that particular group. And that is the group of elements that is new. And that's the one that I want you to focus on. It will be somewhat equivalent to creating clouds on a file and just saying, hey, just focus on this if you like. That's one example out of many, not the only one, but one example that you can use for that purpose. And then going back the steps, you remember when I was creating the types for these individual columns in here, which might be relevant for the sake of quantity surveying or simply identifying things. One thing that you'll notice when you have or when you move from the model tree in the typical distribution, and if you move into switch to component hierarchy, which are the actual types, if I open this column folder, the next level of folders actually describes the different types in this particular file. In my case, I'm not sure if you remember, but let's go quickly take a look at this. So these ones here are actually UB for Universal Beam 150 by 14. That is this one here, UB 150 by 14, and then the size, I believe probably have added the size to it. What that is simply a way for you to identify things based on their types. That is a relationship that is created across multiple elements, so you can easily identify things depending on their types. I will show you the other column types that are 300 by 450, or these 300 by 450 here, or some of the other ones. But the important thing in here is that that's going to allow you to identify things in much better way than, let's say, this shell 1 generic external cladding, which doesn't mean much, doesn't tell me anything much about the actual element. Same thing will apply for doors or curtain walls and so on. So it is good for you to define those types early on, and that will take you through a much better explicit definition of your file. All right, so no questions so far. So that will give you the access to IFC groups, IFC systems and zones. Limited amount of time, didn't have the time to show you these two, but it will be fairly a similar thing done from within Archicad. All right, so that it is all for today, guys. If you have any questions now or later, please feel free to send those through or join us on next Tuesday at the same time. It might be 11:30 though. I need to double check what marketing has planned for us. But it should be next Tuesday as well. Again, remember, for any technical issues, you can get access to that either in Australia and New Zealand through those emails on the screen. For anything else that regards your accounts or any access to any additional items, get in touch with the account manager that might be in charge of your the Archicad licenses in your company for both Australia and New Zealand. And thank you very much for your time. We'll see you next time. Thank you for coming. We'll see you. Cheers.